So we know that in OCD, the more parents accommodate their children's symptomatology, the higher we can expect that child's symptom severity to be, the lower their psychosocial functioning, the poorer that child responds to subsequent intervention. The picture that has been painted by that literature is clear enough that Ellie and his colleagues published a randomized control trial earlier this year using, so Connie, you have to be aware of the space. This is another space, not the one that you use, measuring the efficacy of a space protocol. And this is a protocol that specifically works in parent-mediated intervention, targeting the way in which parents respond to their child's symptoms, again, in OCD. The content of that paper is outside the scope of this talk, but for anyone interested in that field, I would strongly recommend it. It's an important piece of work. What Ellie and I spoke about over this cup of coffee was the partial phenotypic overlap that we know exists between autism and OCD, specifically in the area of criterion B in the DSM, those RRBs that Connie referred to earlier. The overlap exists and is expressed even in the DSM itself. If you open the DSM and you look at the definition of the diagnostic criteria for autism, criterion B there is delineated as restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior, interests, or activities. If you turn to OCD, you see compulsions defined as repetitive behaviors or mental acts. It is possible that this link goes much deeper than just phenotypic. We know that there are high rates of comorbidity between autism and OCD. We know that children of parents with OCD are at higher risk for being diagnosed with autism. And conversely, there is elevated risk of OCD in relatives of people with autism. And so it's possible that there's a genotypic link between these two disorders as well. I do want to take a step back from family accommodation, actually, before we dive into our study and talk about RRBs. As Connie mentioned earlier, RRBs are sort of the neglected child here. Most of the research done, certainly clinical intervention research, the lion's share focuses on impairment in social communication and interaction. I think that is very understandable, though, and we heard Connie refer to this earlier. RRBs themselves are an extremely complex and heterogeneous set of behaviors and symptoms. And while we would say that most symptoms that fit into criterion A, impairment in social communication and interaction, are worth targeting and are worth intervening around, that's not automatically true about all the symptoms that would fit into criterion B, into the RRBs. So some are, of course, self-injurious behavior is something that we always want to minimize. But repetitive motor acts, hand flapping, pacing, may have adaptive functions, may be self-regulatory, and we may not actually want to target those in intervention. And so the notion of developing an intervention that targets RRBs is an idea that sort of makes my head hurt when I try to think about the complexity and the subjective nature of what that would have to look like. So back to our cup of coffee. So Ellie and I set about to ask a fairly simple question. First, can this notion of family accommodation be applied to the world of autism? In other words, do parents of children with autism accommodate their children's symptomatology, specifically their repetitive behaviors or stereotyped interests? If such accommodation takes place, with what does it correlate? Before I continue, I want to pause and say that I'm aware of the sensitivity inherent in speaking about anything that can be interpreted as linking characteristics or behavior of parents to a child's autism symptomatology. Our field has a fairly dark history in this area, dating all the way back to Koller, who said, and then maybe retracted, and maybe didn't retract, it's still under debate, but he certainly wrote at various points that what he saw in his group of children may be related to a genuine lack of maternal warmth. The torch containing that fortunate and misinformed view was famously picked up by Bruno Bettelheim and his followers, who did immeasurable damage to a generation of autism parents. Now, those views have largely, hopefully, been left in the past. But we still see findings all the time that relate something about parents to autism risk, or to the likelihood of a child being diagnosed with autism, whether that's maternal diabetes, parental age, taking or not taking folic acid before and during pregnancy. And so, while these findings are obviously very different than the ones that I mentioned earlier, we still should take into account that there is a psychological process here wherein parents may feel that something they did or did not do is related to the fact that they now have a child with autism. And so, in the context of this study, I want to be very clear about our relatively modest and straightforward goals. What we set out to do was to examine the association between child symptomatology and parents' behavior in the context of these symptoms. Ultimately, to consider this as a possible new port of entry into supporting children and their families, but because of what I mentioned earlier, that ultimately is say, a very long time from here. How did we go about doing this? So first we took, see our things on the slides have jumped a little bit. First we took an existing measure of family accommodation from OCD and anxiety, and we modified it to be appropriate for our population, creating the family accommodation scale for RRBs, or the FAS-RRB. We assessed the face validity by giving it to a bunch of parents of children with autism to make sure that things made sense. Some of those parents are in this room. One of them is going to speak actually in a few minutes. So if you have a problem with the measure, feel free to bring it up with Alex. And then we took the family accommodation scale and the RBSR, which is sort of a tried and true parent measure of repetitive behaviors, and we added them into the already gold standard diagnostic evaluation that was taking place in Dietza's unit at Shamir Hospital. So what is the family accommodation scale? What are we actually looking at here? So the entire questionnaire is only 11 items, wherein the former 7 items measure actual accommodation. So how often do parents provide items to their children related to their repetitive behaviors or stereotyped interests? Do they help their children avoid stimuli related to these symptoms? Have they, in accommodation of these symptoms, avoided doing things, going places, modified the family routine, work schedule, etc.? The latter 4 items of the measure look not at accommodation itself, but at the ramifications of parents engaging or not engaging in such accommodation. So when parents accommodate, does just engaging in that accommodation cause the parents distress? When they do not accommodate, does that cause the child distress? The initial findings from this project have been published already in JAD back in May, so what I'm presenting here is a confirmation of our earlier findings run on a larger sample and initial expansion of those initial results. Okay, that's okay. The point of this slide actually, so you can ignore it and you can just focus on what I'm saying. The point of this slide was just to highlight that this is actually a very heterogeneous sample. So this is not a sample of kids and families that we recruited into the lab. These are all the children that came into Dietza's clinic and were diagnosed with it, were provided with an initial diagnosis of autism in the years, those years continue, but in the years that we were collecting data. And so you see that average age of 6 with a standard deviation of 3. About a quarter of them were females. What you can't see here, because everything's mumble jumble, is that heterogeneity is expressed all over. So it's expressed in terms of the autism symptom severity, it's expressed in adaptive behavior, and so we are not making a statement here about a specific subgroup of children with autism. This is not sort of a neat lab-based sample. These are all the kids, 140 in total, that were diagnosed with autism initially in Dietza's unit. I've put the faces of the graduate students who led the various pieces of the study up in the corners to give credit where credit is due. I think the most significant finding, and the most important statement we can make based on the work we've done until now, is that accommodation is prevalent. So 4 out of 5 parents said that they engaged in such accommodation at least once a month, where more than half of the parents in our study said that they engage in such accommodation on a daily basis. So what does this mean? When parents are telling us that they engage in accommodation, what is actually happening in their homes? So a few examples from the families that we saw. There's a young boy who gets upset when his bed and room are not neatly arranged in a highly specific fashion. So that need is accommodated by parents who wake up in the morning, get their child to school, and then instead of going to work, come home in order to arrange the child's room just so that the child is okay when they get home from school. But by doing that, that parent is now arriving at work late every day. A young girl who must organize the dishes and set the table in a specific fashion herself every night is accommodated by parents who are willing to take out the dishes and the silverware, put them on the table, and then wait for the daughter to be able to set the table in just that specific fashion. And only when that happens are they able to sit down as a family and eat dinner. So the notion of eating dinner as a family is foreign to me personally, actually, but it sounds lovely. A final example is a boy who has to have a specific cookie in their hand every time they leave the house. and that need is accommodated by parents who always make sure to have that specific type of cookie in stock at home. And they place a cookie jar next to the door so that the child doesn't have to go anywhere else or ask for it. On their way out, they can just reach over and pick the cookie up and have that in hand as they leave. What we found was that here we have the correlations between the family accommodation measure and on your left, the measure of repetitive behavior, and on your right, the violent and adaptive behavior scale. And what we see is that families in our sample that engaged in more accommodation had children with more severe symptomatology in the form of their RRPs and lower adaptive behavior as measured by the violent. We also were able to predict, although it's a tricky term, so I'll say associate family accommodation by looking at RRBs, adaptive behavior, and anxiety, but really it seems like the primary factor here seems to be the RRBs themselves. Diving in a little bit deeper, and Yael Ben-Chaim's picture should have been up there, so I apologize to Yael, although she's not here, so you know what she doesn't know. We stratified part of the sample into two age groups, below and over the age of 6. And we found something that we did not expect to find, and something that I can't fully explain yet. In the group below the age of 6, the results mirror those that we found in the entire sample. In the group over the age of 6, we found that there was not a correlation between adaptive behavior and family accommodation. And there, family accommodation was predicted by repetitive behavior and anxiety. So to sum up, we went about asking a couple of simple questions. Does family accommodation exist in the context of autism? The answer seems to be, at least in our group, yes, and it occurs fairly frequently. With what is it associated? It seems to be associated with increased RRB severity and lower adaptive functioning. But it's certainly important to note that there's a developmental perspective that's necessary here. And I think, the findings here, I think they're significant, they're important, but for us, I think that the main takeaway is actually not these specific findings, but where do we go from here? In that we feel that this is something worth paying attention to, but we don't understand most of the nuance of what we're actually saying. So in terms of limitations and complications, this is a single time point study, a very heterogeneous sample, as we said, and all the measures that we're using here are parent reported, so it's a specific perspective. In addition, while that overlap exists between autism and OCD, the overlap exists largely on a behavioral level in terms of the RRBs that we're talking about. The question that we must ask is, what is the function of this behavior? So if you have a child with OCD and a child with autism engaging in the same behavior, that doesn't necessarily mean that the function of that behavior is the same. And in the context of OCD, we feel confident saying that compulsive behaviors are always part of an endless cycle of anxiety, elevation, and reduction. And in RRBs, that's not true. We don't feel comfortable making that statement in any type of general fashion. In terms of our next steps, so we're thinking about how to tease apart the relationship between different types of accommodation, which may be helpful or unhelpful, in the context of different types of RRBs, which may be adaptive or maladaptive, and the interaction between those two things. This is Shani, who's about to begin a longitudinal follow-up study, so bringing families back 1 to 2 years after the time of diagnosis to look at this from a longitudinal and developmental perspective. This is Irit, who is in the audience, and so I'll be nice. So Irit, who's in the audience, and will be leading a collaboration with Professor Anat Zayed of Tel Aviv University, looking at a qualitative perspective. I got it. At a qualitative perspective on family accommodation. So, as we said, this whole questionnaire it's fairly simple. It's only 11 items, so we really want to understand what is actually happening in homes, and we'll specifically be targeting a few times during the day. So, I believe it's when they go to sleep, mealtime, and transition time. But the ultimate question still remaining: what effect will the reduction of accommodation have? And is that something that we even want to consider? Is that something that's of value considering in terms of thinking about an intervention in this area? So this is my lab. This is the team at Shamir Hospital. I've been assured that they're not being arrested here, but are rather at an escape room. I just want to thank all my collaborators and students for being able to do this work. We have time for one question. So of course there are differences. I don't have those data here, but there are differences. What surprised me actually about that stratification was that these are all kids who are being diagnosed initially. And so I would have thought that what we were looking at was sort of a natural way in which family accommodation has developed until the point of diagnosis. And then everything should shift, right? Because parents begin to understand what is autism, what is RRPs, are these things we want to encourage or not encourage. But it seems like that's not the case. What's happening here is shifting developmentally whether or not the child has been diagnosed with autism. So I don't know.